That's my theme. I thought it was very appropriate for a hackathon that lasts one day. That means you can get it over with faster and start recovery. So my objective today, just to be clear about it, was not to prepare you for the hackathon today, but rather to address some thoughts, some feelings, some possibilities that relate to the general activity that you are involved in. And I take it up as something that is not literally love and not literally breaking one's heart, although that's the language you use, and there's a reason for it. But the key in approaching the idea of talking about love or heartbreak in relation to software development, mobile app development, hackathons, design, user-centered approaches to the world that we engage as designers, and designers in the broadest sense. Do any of you think of yourselves as designers here in the room? A wavy hand? Okay, well, those qualify as designers. Think of design not in a particular sense of a discipline or a skill area, but rather purposeful work that intends to have non-random outcomes. That's a designer. So I think you all qualify as a designer, whether you like it or not. I won't go around spreading the word, I won't take names. So we can get rid of love, because how many of you were a little put off or surprised or didn't really see the relevance of that? Be honest. Did you expect it? Did you think that that was going to be kind of like the focus of the session? No, I'm confident you did not. So let's substitute empathy for love. I think that's a little safer, right? How many of you feel that you have empathy or you're empathetic in your daily lives as a human? That's incredible. I mean, that's great. We won't test it. I mean, we don't have time to. But the fact is that empathy can be thought of as one of the primary criteria for you engaging in work that is intended to benefit other humans. If you do not understand them and their circumstances, how can you possibly create software that benefits them? Now, it might benefit you, it might benefit the company or institution you're working for, it might advance a career objective, it might add to your portfolio, but it isn't necessarily empathy that is driving it. I think most people feel that they're empathetic. The question is how and when and how you organize it, because in a sense you can organize empathy. And as a designer, a developer, entrepreneur, nonprofit director, teacher, etc., I am in the empathy business across all of those areas. So what I want to raise with this little change in the sentence in my call to action, in a sense, this is basically invoking that there is more than just the specific requirements or specification objectives. And in fact, that cannot be the only set of criteria or objectives that drive your work. If it is, not only will it break your heart, but it will disappoint others as well. It will fall short of its intentions. But empathy is a good thing to start with. And in fact, design thinking as a construct which is emerged out of decades of experience, design, UX, user-centered design sort of practices and terminology that tries to describe empathy as one of the starting points in such a design process that's projected for us. We can also cancel out the empathy part if necessary. The chances are that, and this is not at all to demean what you're involved with today, in fact, my purpose is in fact to give you some cautionary tale some objective experiential basis to put it in perspective, not to change or undermine your activity as a nascent designer, whether you call yourself that or not. And we can replace empathy with just design, because the design activity, the design process, the purposeful construction of non-random outcomes is going to come out of design one way or another. The organization of the work, defining a system and building it, etc. And the break part, maybe that's overstating it. I've been accused of being theatrical and hyperbolic in the past, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. So it isn't necessarily going to break your heart. But UX design, like experience design, can prevent heartbreak. And the kind of heartbreak that I'm alluding to, or that's referenced here, is not, doesn't really have anything to do with your heart. And you probably suspected that coming into this. But it does raise a question about how we identify, how we linguistically communicate things like, oh, you broke my heart. In fact, that is a fundamental aspect of what the objective of empathy is, which is to be able to project and relate to others across a range of possible forms that relating might take, from being very sympathetic to just being insightful and analytical about a condition. They all can be included in empathy. But it also refers to something that is not neocortex based. It's not about what and how of things. It's about the why of things, to indirectly quote Simon Sinek. The fact is that the heart, the felt dimension, the emotional response to software, to digital objects, to even the devices that they're presented on or engaged through, is often related to on a level that we say, well, I didn't really feel that. You know, it didn't get me in the gut. My gut feeling isn't, you know, I'm not comfortable with this. That isn't analytical. That isn't even in language. It's like you're substituting words like heartbreak to account for events or outcomes that are really maybe not at all about heartbreak, and it isn't the heart where the issue is. It's at some other level, right? So as we move forward to think about designing things, and to take a diagrammatic, kind of more concrete, empirical expression of a process that we might be engaging in, to set off on a set of tasks that produce a materialized outcome. This is from the NN group, Nelson Norman group, a design thinking diagram. That, how many of you have seen such diagrams? So they account for a process, an organized expression of what we do to get from start to finish. This is a pretty well understood one. This is a relatively new version of what has emerged, as I said, starting back in the early to mid 90s, with an understanding that it couldn't just be systems design. It couldn't just be industrial design. It had to be integrated, and it had to be getting at the core dimensions of human responses to human created objects. And an object obviously can be a website or an app or the device that displays them. So empathy, again, this reason I picked up on that at the beginning is it's been institutionalized and codified as a starting point. Unfortunately, many times we're denied that. For projects that I've worked on over the years, only because I've come to understand and can point to outcomes that are rooted in starting with empathy, and the insights that it can produce has ensured a quality and a kind of a viability of the outcomes of the work that could only probably have been possible with having an empathetic starting point. And it's not just to say, oh, I want to do something that's going to help that person, or I want to do something that will solve a problem that will benefit others. It doesn't even necessarily mean that you are truly empathetic, and we're not going to test anybody on this. You may not really relate to benefiting others in the world. You know, technology for social good, for example, kind of orientation. It can be much more pragmatic. It can be much more cold-blooded, which also is not a real thing for humans, any more than heartbreak is, literally. But we can relate to the fact that if we are not able to gain sufficient and appropriate insights into the end users of that thing that we're designing and building, we are likely to fail in some important ways. That doesn't mean we're guaranteed failure at all, because we haven't been empathetic in the history of software development, or the last 40 plus years at the very least that we've been paying attention to it. We have had a lot of non-empathetic activity. But it doesn't mean that we have terrible software or terrible devices, does it? The question is, how much better can it be if we exercise some of those considerations? So, have I used up all the time just doing setup, or are we still good for time? So that's the introduction. So let me tell you a little story. Unless somebody has a question, it gives me a chance to sip some coffee because I'm dry. Anybody have a question about what I've alluded to so far? Does it raise any question in your mind? Do you see it relevant or irrelevant to your situation? Yeah.
What is this diagram called?
Design thinking 101. If you Google design thinking 101, you'd get this diagram. Actually, I could probably be sued for this because I cut off the top part. So I'm not presenting the actual document. You know, it's kind of like trying to spend money, you know, that you cut the head out, you know, the middle of the bill or something like that, I guess. Yeah, but it's called Design Thinking 101. Anybody else? All right, so a story. Recently, in the recent past, my nonprofit group, WebServes, was involved in organizing a long-form hackathon. And when I say long-form, I mean 2.5 months long. It would be like, you know, it'd be like you came today and you were locked into this room for 2.5 months and you walked out, you know, with the result, whatever that happened to be. Probably it would be more like Lord of Flies kind of situation, and we don't even want to think about the consequences, but software did come out of on the end. The predicate for this effort was a programmatic structure that we called the Empathy Project, without an E, M-P-A-T-H-Y, which was intended to identify, instead of coming up with our own ideas about what we thought would be worth spending time on or building, you know, as a design shop, as a development group, we could have just looked around and said what would be great to do, as you are all going to be, in a sense, in a position to make those kind of decisions today, and in any situation organized this way. But we had because I have a somewhat twisted mind on occasion, I wanted to make it harder than that, and I wanted it to be more relevant in a sense that I could understand and people I work with could understand, which is in the sense, we wanted to identify institutions, organizations, particularly NGO and nonprofit groups, that already were involved in addressing serious issues, serious problems faced by vulnerable populations somewhere in the world, but that needed an edge, needed a technology intervention, something that they could identify as being relevant to their work, because they might have people working out in the field, you know, they might be training or educating people to do things for themselves, etc. Any area, whether it was literacy or epidemiology or climate change impact in Bangladesh. You know, you could take a problem, there are going to be people who are working on it. And rather than us as designers and developers needing to understand that problem thoroughly, fully, we decided that we would look for groups that had the problem and wanted a technology solution to help address it. Okay, so that was the concept. So we had a group approach us, and they had a problem, a well-defined problem, one that they had been involved with for addressing like over 20 years. And they were very passionate about it. They had a lot of knowledge. They've been trying to get congressional, action. They've organized educational efforts, worked with teenagers in schools, et cetera, a lot of things, but there were some very obdurate, challenging aspects of them making a difference in their problem space. The problem space was something that was immediately very kind of, what do you want to say, edgy and buzzy in a sense. It was the commercial exploitation of children for sexual purposes, which is a global problem, but a lot of people don't realize that it's a problem that is very large and has huge impact on the US itself. It doesn't just happen in other parts of the world, in Southeast Asia or whatever. So they said, we want an app. We're not sure what it would look like or exactly how it would work. We're not tech people. We don't have any people in our staff to really kind of help interpret it. Can you address that problem? Can we create an app that would allow tracking and reporting and ideally identifying at-risk youth and those who put them at risk in areas that could be accessed, meaning not things that are hidden away in some obscure place, but that would be occurring in hotels, motels, touristic facilities, etc. So I don't know what your reaction would have been if somebody kind of knocked on your door one day and said, do I have a problem for you to spend time on? But we said yes, we would help facilitate that. Well, what followed was trying to identify what the problem was, right? And what is the problem? Well, we can say, well, there's this big epic problem. Young people are being coerced, kidnapped, taken away from their parents, pulled off the street, etc., and forced or influenced, depending on who's viewing it, to engage in a range of activity that is harmful to that young person at very least, and not only the individual, but their families, their friends, their communities. So the problem was not so clear, meaning that we didn't have any experience with it, and we were basically opening it up to people like yourselves. We put out a call in various environments, tech groups, a couple of schools, not PACE. I'm sorry we didn't. In the future that will change. But we gathered together a similar group, and we said, does anyone have any knowledge of this problem? And no one raised their hand, although we found out later that in fact some of them did know something about it, but they weren't able to say that openly and publicly. But the organization that was hosting this problem had spent years cultivating information about what the problem was, where it existed, how it impacted people, how young men and boys are, kind of groomed and cultivated into that world, into that area, into those activities. And in fact, we're involved with both trying to make students and teachers in lower grades, who are often the targets of some of that recruitment, as well as HR departments in hotel chains and involved with large tourism organizations. It took a session almost as long as your day with experts, trainers, teachers, presenting information about the problem. And that was something they could do. I mean, they were in a position to say, this is what the problem is. You often want to know what the problem is. And you also, as designers, developers, programmers, entrepreneurs, need to understand the problem, even if it is incomplete understanding, even if it is as much as you can gather for purposes of action, right? Because we weren't just interested in studying that problem. We weren't academics. We wanted to make material things happen. We wanted to build something software-based that could make a difference. But understanding the problem was the first step. So from empathize, I mean, almost everybody empathized. There were a few people who were actually turned off by the topic. They found it too unsettling and left the group. And of course, that was their choice, and we understood it. But defining it is a major issue, defining the problem. So you never want to move forward on something unless you have at least some degree of definition, you know, and that requires discovery. That's another aspect of design thinking that is not in this little diagram, but discovery is critical, because as we found out, when we began to discover the problem and began ideating, thinking about, well, what form it could take, what it would do, how it would act, what literally would it provide from the standpoint of documentation? Could you use a camera? Could you use audio recording? Could you take video? Could you just fill out a form that sort of ticked off, you know, sort of what you were observing, right? Like grading the thing on the basis of indicators of like prospective danger or risk. When we began to ideate and move toward a prototype, because we had the intention of building a prototype, much like you are. We didn't use Proto.io, we used Envision app, which I'm sure your instructors and some of you probably know. It's one among many of prototyping apps, many of which are very equivalent, by the way. Don't get caught up in that competitive app game. But some are just a little bit more robust than others, and you adopt the ones that suit your purposes. And when something comes along that really is better, you never want to stay faithful to software unless it's your own, and even then you want, as Noel Coward, I think, who said, you must learn to kill your darlings. And we, as software designers, also must, you know, sometimes, if there's something better or something that's surpassed it. So when we began to ideate and begin to give definition to what the thing would do, how it would act in relation to the problem, addressing the problem, the organization that came to us said, we don't know, we don't understand how that would work. We never thought of it that way. We never thought about a problem of taking a photograph in the back hallways, the maintenance areas of a hotel. What is the legal ramifications of somebody who's doing housekeeping in a motel down the road near the airport, capturing a photograph of somebody in a room? Is that a privacy violation? Is it going to get the person fired, etc.? The questions that came out of the process of the ideation went way beyond anything that the primary stakeholder, and the primary stakeholder was the nonprofit group that had been working on addressing the problem. They became more fully educated to the implications of the very thing they asked for. That's a risk that sometimes is a problem. I worked on projects where the people that hired me decided they wanted to fire me because of the issues that I was raising. It was making it more complicated. It was making it more difficult. Why couldn't I stick to the concept? You have to learn to navigate those kind of constraints, but they are going to exist, just as there is a time constraint, which some of you find exciting and other people might find oppressive. Fine. You'll deal with that. because you may be in a situation from week to week or from month to month working for the same group in the same company in the same environment and have that and all the in-between experiences along the way. So we tried to get to prototype, and we did. It took, as I said, 2.5 months. We had planned it to happen on that time. It required 3 workshops. One was basically discovery, what was the problem. The second was sort of beginning to lay out possible responses to the physical engagement, the being present to situations that required some documentation or reporting, how that reporting was gathered and captured, what kind of data sets were implicated, where did the data go after you acquired it, etc. And then we had a third workshop where we had more mentors involved with what were the technical implications, right? Like data storage, for example. If you have a mobile device, what are you going to store on that device? Hopefully nothing, especially if it's incriminating, especially if it has criminal implications. You don't want to put some low-wage worker, in a hotel carrying around in their pocket something that would get them arrested by somebody or charged in a lawsuit. Well, the discovery was so, in fact, potent that what emerged was that this was a risky proposition. It wasn't just documenting, it isn't just capturing data, it isn't just making observations and ticking off the points that were observed in some kind of systematic kind of schedule of values. It became legal, it became policy, it became a question of personal discretion, it became an issue of ethics. Who was it that got reported? Where did the information go? Did it go directly to law enforcement? If you were working in a hotel and you saw something happen and you had your app on your phone when you were able to record, document in some way this event, are you mandated or required to report that to law enforcement? Or are you answerable to your supervisor, the person above you in the line? And that emerged as a criteria as well. So the organization had to go back to their hotel people and their motel people and their tourism people and ask questions about, well, we're looking at this and we're trying to build a piece of software that's going to help us address this serious problem, but we have some questions, we have some issues. We got to prototype. Nicely constructed for the most part, the interfaces were well put together. The logic, the internal logic was pretty solid. It reflected a lot of the insights and the potential forms that it would take. And it ended up being something that wasn't a native mobile app. Only we saw 2 iterations coming out of it. One would be for tablets and laptops, because the other parties in the mix were supervisors and managerial staff, not just the people who were like out in the, in the exposure to the client area. So it began to elaborate, but we came up with a set of prototypes, and we had a award session, and 2 young women were the top prize winners. I'm looking at a room mostly male. I wanted to emphasize that. We have a need to encourage a kind of more gender representation in the tech space to our own benefit over the future. But that piece of software never went beyond that prototype. It was never built. It didn't even go to beta. It didn't get into the hands of anyone working in the very environment that we had spent so long trying to understand. And yet, there was no fundamental technical problem that we observed or had been observed by our technical consultants, including a couple of engineers from Google. What do you think happened? Why didn't it go past the prototype? What did we miss? What did we not do? Anybody have a sense? Play detective for a moment.
is it also helping the showing the kids place, where are they? So it's the positive, it has benefits but also have negative effect on it, that's why?
A negative effect like, just to give me a sense, when you say
Like, basically we are trying to protect the kids from some other people, right?
Right.
But if they hack, they can basically know where the kid is. So it might be a problem. To come up with.
Okay. Let's just say categorically there could be some negative implications. Anybody else have a sense of what kind of negative implications with the little bit of knowledge that you have? I know I've been talking a bit, but I didn't go into all the detail possible.
It like put the users in like a legal binding, like to the situation that they weren't necessarily involved in.
Yeah, I think that's a corollary of his comment. Yes, absolutely, that has a potential. The other thing, I mean, because one of the key things is to understand the implications for the users. It isn't just having a kind of user-centric idea, and from the standpoint of the interface and usability criteria, things like that, which is relevant, but it also are these indirect sometimes or direct consequences of the very use of that software, right? So I think those are good points. Anybody else have any idea of what would have prevented this from going beyond prototype? Did you have a thought, or you?
I was just thinking maybe testing the product.
No, there was no real obstacles there. I mean, we could have easily tested, and in fact, some of the participants in the project did usability testing. They recruited people to test their prototype on the screen level, which we can do just with paper, right? How many of you do paper prototypes or have been exposed to that? So we can do very low-tech exposures to screen level realities and get a lot of insights to move forward. So that wasn't really an obstacle. You have?
I was thinking, like, for example, China, they don't like use Google. Like, instead of it, they use the, what was it, Weibo or something like that. So like they didn't necessarily, like, they had more, like authorization of like what was it? Letting them using the what was it, Chrome?
Well, in this case,
Regulation-wise?
what was common to almost all the designs is there was no internet connection required. The only time that the internet was involved was when data was transferred, and that could be done asynchronously, right? It didn't have to happen in the process. And in fact, we came up with the concept in the third workshop that we would try to not just look at locking the device and making it secure from intrusion or access to it, but also basically emptying it, in effect, right? Offloading all the data that had acquired. We didn't take up really sophisticated issues about, like trackable metadata or things like that, but that wasn't a challenge. Yeah.
Supposing it was to be released in the States, there's different state laws that might make it incredibly complicated for.
There probably were, although we didn't really explore them. I mean, we didn't really have the resources to, but I agree that certainly raised some issues right through to the federal level, in fact. Because there are various laws that address those issues, and I think Congress just passed a FOSTA, they refer to as the FOSTA law that addresses, pursuit of the tracking and reporting of these kinds of activities. Anybody else have? Yeah.
Well, maybe also the businesses involved, like the hotel wouldn't be too keen on it, I don't think, right? Well, I don't know, I mean, like, because there's probably a lot of edge cases that you can foresee. I don't know.
I
Well,
also feel like this app lacks the user education, like how to identify like the kids is at risk, let's record it or something like that.
well, in fact, all of the envisioned users, adopters of the software would be hotel businesses, chains, et cetera, et cetera. And all of the ones that were targeted for likely adoption of the use of the tool were already having HR level training from the organization, from the host organization that brought the problem to us, that helped identify, like what are the telltale signs, what are the indicators, and in fact, we use that as data structure for doing reporting. So, we even like designed a simple, kind of like algorithm script that would kind of be able to take, like, you saw, there are, let's say, 6 indicators, and, if you have 1 out of 6, it's like, you've got 2 out of 6, it's, and then it's, et cetera, up to 6, and it's like, like, wah, 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 it was not literally sounding, I just like making sound effects. But, kind of like threat level kind of thing, right? So, it wasn't a problem with the users, even at the staff level, even at the at the lower paid kind of more, let's say, basic labor categories would have been exposed to some of the issues. That doesn't mean that they were all equally, they didn't go to school for it, they did some workshops, right? But you're on point. The fact of the matter is that what prevented this from going past prototype is that none of the businesses, none of the hotels, none of the chains, I'm not mentioning any names, wanted this friggin' thing in their stores. They didn't want an application like that in the hands of their employees. Even though they all signed the declaration of compliance and adherence and support of the principles. It's like nations that subscribe to the United Nations Bill of Rights, right? Human rights. And then go ahead and commit genocide. We don't have to go into any instances there either. But the fact is that that was not a small thing. That wasn't even something that we should have had to wait to find out. What that was a missing piece of our hypothesis. You cannot proceed to build something that you don't know who is decisive, who meaning what, is decisive in determining its ability to see the world. It's not even the same as an entrepreneurial startup that has a great idea, right? And they want to get it out. They can get it out even if they don't get it out enough to make it viable from a business perspective. This is a situation that a nonprofit organization wanted to do something for an end user, a category of user, and empathetically everybody bought into that and sympathized with the organization. It was just like, who could argue with wanting to help the kids, right? But in a sense, that empathy, that caring, that love, you know where I'm going with this, right? Resulted in a heartbreak in the sense that it didn't go past prototype. Now, we don't have to have heartbreaks like that. We at least should have them harder won, meaning let's have heartbreaks that we could not possibly have foreseen. This was foreseeable. We just didn't look for it. So what I wanted to communicate today was not a negative as much as to talk about the potential implications of the work that we do. It can really be incredibly impactful. It can really change lives. That doesn't mean everything we work on has to. You don't say, well, I'm not going to touch that because it's not going to save 100,000 people. But what you want to be able to do is understand that for it to be able to be implemented and effective, you have to really assess all the key influencers in that dynamic. You're not responsible for all of them. What was our job as designers and developers to go out and convince the hotels to use it? Clearly not. And it isn't like our responsibility ethically or morally to have done everything possible to avoid it going out, but we could have exercised a certain amount of diligence in looking at what the definable contributing factors are that will determine the likely fate of our work. Thank you.
We have time for one question. If you have one question, yes?
I have a question regarding the diagram. So why the arrows are going backwards?
Why are the arrows going backwards? Okay, well, let's see if I can go back. Oh, there was supposed to be the punchline, by the way, which was, you do it anyway, right, even if it's gonna be heartbreak. The arrows going back reflect iteration. One of the key concepts behind experience design, from a design thinking perspective, from an accumulation of kind of understanding iterative process, is that it isn't waterfall. It isn't like we start and we just kind of move through a sequence of phases until we get to the end and shake each other's hand and we'll drink champagne. The fact is that every one of these points in a definable process, and this is obviously simplified, can be returned to a previous stage in the design process and put through that process again. So this is the classic one, but any of these should allow for it, right? I mean, we in fact went through, even with that one project, we went through a number of cycles of review of what we initially thought would be a viable approach, until we arrived at kind of a general consensus about it being in the hands of workers at those hotels and motels, and they didn't need special education, et cetera, and there would be certain features that would allow security to be in place, et cetera. But testing, you raised the question about prototyping and testing. The testing dimension, as early as possible, is the classic criteria, right? We want to test as early as possible. Most everything that's screen-based, the earliest that we really can test for it is at the wireframe level, right, where we have a UI. But we can get a lot of information before we commit any other resources, or even do requirements defining, right? Going back to prototype, making corrections to it, maybe even going back to some earlier assumptions that we've brought to play, and then moving forward again, testing again for it, until we get diminishing return on our testing, right? And then we can say, all right, I'm not discovering anything really new yet that should influence my revisions. Let's take it out. Let's turn it into an alpha. Let's get it out to a broader range of people.